Okay, hey everyone, I'm Roy. And,
Hey Roy.
Hey, how's it going? I'm going to introduce Rob Graham today. He's also, you can find him on Twitter on Errata Rob. He's the creator of Black Ice. How many people use Black Ice? Or have you?
Back in the day.
Back in the day.
Back in the day.
So now introducing Rob Graham.
Thank you very much. Today I'm going to talk to you, it's not really about cybersecurity in fashion, it's about economics. And one of the struggles we have is talking to executives. How many people here have trouble talking to executives and business people? Okay, so most of us. So my goal here is to take something that the executives know, the executives think about, which is economics, and then work backwards to cybersecurity. So that when we talk to them, we can talk with the same language. So we have this frustration that they don't know our terminology, so I thought it'd be a good idea to sort of help them, or to teach ourselves their terminology. And the inspiration for this, by the way, is a series of books called Freakonomics by some economists that take economics and apply it to real-world situations, like drug dealers and prostitution and teaching and so forth. Trying to take that same sort of approach and apply it to cybersecurity. So here's our typical conversation with the executive, where we tell them they need a firewall. They say, well, why do I need a firewall? And we say, well, because if you don't have one, you'll be insecure. And they say, okay, so if I buy a firewall, then I'll be perfectly secure, right? And we go, well, no, not really. It's, perfect security isn't impossible, blah, 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 blah. So they come back and they say, well, then why do I need a firewall? And we don't really have an answer at that point, other than saying things, well, it's the right thing to do, and that sort of thing. So what I'd like to do is be able to talk economics to them and tell them in economics terms why they need a firewall. So here's our typical sort of thing that we all repeat in cybersecurity. If you spend more on coffee than on IT security, then you will be hacked, the more you deserve to be hacked. But this idea of that there's a moral imperative for cybersecurity is something that executives don't understand. They just want to know dollars and cents. So this starts to become a very irrational thing for us to say to our bosses and our bosses' bosses and the CEO. And here's another good example I like. In season 3 of The Simpsons, the Germans come to buy the nuclear power plant. And so Homer's there in the break room chatting with his friends and stuff, and the new German owners come on by, and he wants to look important. Like he's doing something, like he's actually not a useless employee. So he said, hey, you, stop being so unsafe. Hey, Smitty, safe it up. And that's what our organizations are sort of filled with. There's a lot of security owners in our organizations who don't really know security or much of anything other than they can say things like, hey, safe it up. So when our German owners come on by to our companies, we need to have something a little bit more logical to say to them. So what this is imagine that I'm a professor, that we're at a university. Just imagine we're at a university. Now I'm in front of the room. Just imagine where they are. And so what I'm going to do is give a small class on Economics 101. And of course, hinged by the fact that I'm really talking about cybersecurity. So a lot of us have this misconception about economics, that when we say the economics of DDoS, for example, what we're talking about is dollars and cents, how much it costs, how much they earn, that sort of thing. That's not really economics, that's business. So when we think economics, it's not about the flows of money necessarily, it's about something else. We'll get to that. People have talked about economics before within cybersecurity. And the biggest thing they talk about is this idea of tragedy of the commons. That, for example, no one pays attention to cybersecurity, so therefore worms browsing the internet take on the internet. So even if you're secure, the internet's still down for you. And that's really a tiny part of economics. So most of what I'm talking about is not the tragedy of the commons. Another question people have about economics is that's about politics. So here's how you annoy an economist, is you ask them about jobs. Because that's what politicians talk about, is how do we do jobs, how do we improve jobs in that economy. That's kind of like talking to an astronomer and asking them and telling them, hey, I'm Sagittarius. It's a really good way to So here's what economics really is a science. Is what economists do is they measure things. Which is kind of annoying because in the old alchemy version of science, we wanted to know how to convert that into gold. And those are the questions people asked, and we never got an answer to that. But when we stopped pursuing that objective and just say, hey, let's start measuring things, let's create theories, let's test them, let's prove them, then we found lots of interesting answers that weren't involved with gold, but were everything else, like computers. So that's what economics is that the answers you want, it doesn't really give you, but it gives you a lot of other things that you didn't really ask for. So here's the book's Freakonomics. One of the cool things about Freakonomics, one of the stories they tell, is how we know that there's cheating in sumo wrestling. In sumo wrestling, we look at the stats, we measure the stats. And we notice that when a sumo wrestler didn't need to win a fight because he won 5 out of 6 that he needs, so he doesn't care whether he wins or loses the 6th fight, he usually lost. Moreover, they run the numbers, and they found there was trading going on. So the person that they lost to, in some later match, 6 months later, they might win. They're more likely to win against that person. So they don't know where the cheating is coming from, but by measuring, looking at statistics, the way that economists would, they can say, hey, we can prove that there's cheating going on in sumo wrestling. So they published this in Freakonomics, and there's a big, it all blew up in Japan, and people came forward and admitted, yeah, there's cheating going on. It was a big thing. So here are 2 books I recommend, and one of the goals of this talk is to inspire you, which is not a word, but it's not really inspirational, but it's to inspire you to go read some economics books. And one of them I really, really like is The Armchair Economist, which takes everyday things and explains basic economics. And the other one is Freakonomics, which takes everyday things that are sensational and explains economics. Freakonomics is more fun. I think Armchair Economist is more enlightening. Or go get some college textbooks. And here are 2 college textbooks that I've looked at, and they're both very good. One of the impressions people have about economics is that it's a right-wing conspiracy, because economists don't really like fair trade. They focus on free trade. And there are lots of reasons for that. And so the right-hand book is written by a guy named Paul Krugman, who's very well known for writing a left-wing blog on economics on the New York Times. He's quite famous. He's a Nobel laureate and so on and so forth. So whenever you have this impression that there's like economics is a right-wing conspiracy, Paul Krugman's a good guy to read. I prefer Greg Mankiw's books. He's got these 10 principles of economics, which I'm going to talk about in a little economics 101 talk that's coming up. So I'm going to base my talk on his book. But the contents of both books are essentially the same. So in Greg Mankiw's books, his first principle is that everything we do is a matter of trade-offs. Or phrased better is there's no such thing as a free lunch. And so when we talk to our bosses about cybersecurity, we kind of forget this. We kind of say, hey, there is such a thing as a free lunch. And the theory that we sort of work from is that there's some sort of secret cache of money, like the coffee fund, that's just sort of sitting there doing nothing. And that if we don't use that money to buy more antivirus or a firewall or a Nessus scanner, then we can improve things. Because there's money sitting around somewhere that's doing nothing that we can use. But this secret coffee fund is a myth. Every dollar and cent in the business is accounted for. And what the CEO sees is everyone's coming to them, explain to them why they need more money. So the marketing department says we need more money for marketing. If we only had a few more dollars, we can reach this new group of people and we can sell a lot more and make back the money. Sales says the same thing. Engineering says the same thing. HR says, hey, we provide these more benefits to our employees, they'll stick around longer. So every department has this idea, there's this fund of money sitting around doing nothing, and actually no business runs like that. It's all accounted for. One of the biggest cliches that we have is defense in depth. Whenever we talk to our boss and say, I need more budget, we go to them and say, it's because of defense in depth. We need to have multiple layers, I want another layer. But that, to a boss, means nothing, because it's ignoring the trade-offs. And your boss believes that trade-offs exist. So what the boss wants to know is, okay, if we do more, if we buy that Nessus scanner, what are we getting rid of? Getting rid of the McAfee antivirus and the gateway scanner, what are we getting rid of? And that's the problem we have and why they don't listen to us, is we don't ever say that. We never go to our boss and say, hey, yeah, we don't really need the McAfee on the gateway, and we don't really need the checkpoint firewall. We never tell them what we need to get rid of, we only ask them for what we need to add. And if you can ever go and say, hey, I've got trade-offs here. I think we can spend, instead of spending so much money here in cybersecurity, I can spend it over here in cybersecurity, then that's something that they will listen to. By the way, attackers have trade-offs too. We had this idea of attackers will do anything possible to crack a password, but they won't. They'll just go to a certain level of effort and go try something else. As we all know, that there's this rubber hose attack that your password can always be grabbed as long as someone's willing to kidnap your children or kidnap you and take a rubber hose to you and threaten you and force the password out of you. So we have some imagination that only be solved if attackers are doing phishing attacks against us. If only we solve that one problem, they'll go away. It's not true. They'll go off and try something else. Because they have trade-offs. They can choose other things other than the one thing we're blocking them at. Rangula talked about patching recently. And, well, patching is a set of trade-offs. If you patch, if you have auto-install of all patches, take all your Windows desktop and run auto-update. That's one set of trade-offs. Or we can wait 30 days, 29 days, and be just compliant with a certain set of regulations. That's another trade-off. We'll just do PCI compliance every 3 months. Another set of trade-offs. And we sort of think of these things as one is unacceptable. Like we can't wait 90 days, or we can't do it immediately in auto-update. Because of my past experience, we had a big problem. But in reality, they're all trade-offs, and we all need, every time we bring this up and say how long do we take to patch, list all the trade-offs. We don't like it. Remove some of them as being impractical because 2 years ago we had auto-update on and it killed our file servers or something like that. So here's the rational conversation we have to our boss. Is when he asks, why do I need that firewall, we come to him with a list of trade-offs. We say, here are your trade-offs, choose one, basically. And assuming we agree that the firewall is the most effective one, then the boss agrees with us. So number 2 on ManQ's list, we're going back to our Economics 101 college class. Number 2 on ManQ's list is opportunity cost. And the graphic I have here is a basketball player, Kobe Bryant. He skipped high school, or he skipped college. And that's a set of trade-offs. Is he decided, I'm going to go to the NBA early, and that's one set of trade-offs required to wait. And it's always either or, and there's costs and benefits to each. Now think of Amazon.com, eBay, and Yahoo. When these companies started out 15 years ago, they had horrible security. And I've talked to the early people who did these companies, and they all tell me these horror stories that you wouldn't believe. But they had to, because the trade-off, or the opportunity cost, or what it would cost them if they didn't have horrible security, was they wouldn't be the ones who'd be in business today. Because consider 2 companies that have this idea to do online auctions. One company says, hey, we're going to go hot and fast and loose and have security problems, but we'll fix them really quickly, we'll get to market early. That's eBay. The company who said, hey, we're going to do it right, we're not going to put the website up until everything was done correctly. We don't know that company because they no longer exist. So the trade-offs we have are not just the monetary costs, it's the opportunity costs. What aren't we doing? What could we be doing if only we had, if only we were a little bit lax in security? So there's all these hidden costs of cybersec. When your boss comes to you and says, hey, I don't want to do that, they're thinking of these hidden costs. They're thinking, how many customers will I lose because of SSL SSL delays if I turn on SSL everywhere? Facebook is going to turn on SSL everywhere. What's going to happen to Facebook is they're going to lose 0.5% of their customers when they do that, because that's the opportunity cost. But that's what they're losing by going to SSL. I think it's a benefit ultimately, but that's the cost we'll have to pay. Okay, back to our Economics 101 class. We're now going to talk about thinking on the margin. So when you and I drink a bottle of Coke, we just sort of drink the entire bottle of Coke. When an economist does it, they think, oh, what's the marginal benefit of the first sip? What's the marginal benefit of the second sip? And after a hot day, the benefit of the first and second sip are pretty big. But by the time you get to the bottom of the bottle, the marginal benefit goes down. It's like, well, that last sip or not, I can give or take it, I don't care. Well, that's how economists would describe it.
What's the adjective marginal?
Marginal means, that's a good question, additional.
Thank you.
So what's the additional benefit? So what's the additional benefit of another sip of Coke? And that goes down for every sip I take. In gaming, this is a picture from Diablo 3, it's known as diminishing returns. So as you build your character during the game, you get more and more stuff, the additional benefit of stuff goes down. So if you're a barbarian character in Diablo 3, strength is your stat. The more strength you have, the more damage you do. But each additional point of strength has less and less benefit to you. And that's called diminishing returns. So that's how we explain it to geeks. Graphing it is, here's how it looks. I'm spending money on more and more security, and what's the additional benefit I get for each unit of money? For every $10,000 more I spend, I get less and less benefit from additional security. And that's the problem that we have, is we look at problems like phishing attacks, for example. No one's really solved it. And that's because no matter how much we spend, no matter how much trouble we take, it's still a threat. There's always some way that someone can do something new and original and creative that gets behind our defenses. And that's how we need to look at spending, is I've got a firewall, so I can spend more and more money on the firewall, but the more money I spend, there's decreasing marginal returns. The best firewall out there is only slightly better than the worst firewall. And the worst firewall is a lot better than having nothing. So that's to get decreasing marginal returns. So this is a better way, by the way, to explain something like defense in depth. Is instead of putting all your money on the firewall, let's put some on antivirus, some on the firewall, some on intrusion detection, some on scanning, and so forth. There's also this idea of hindsight. In hindsight, there's no decrease in marginal returns. We all know what happened in the past. But think about diminishing returns in foresight. So we're trying to scan the website looking for all SQL injection vulnerabilities or other OWASP stuff. The more we spend, the less bugs, the fewer bugs we find. And that's why Microsoft has bugs. They spend an enormous amount of money, an enormous percentage of their development budget, more than anyone else, on trying to stop bugs from happening in the future, but they can't. No matter how big you are, you can never spend enough money to make your software bug-free. And that's this problem we have. We always think if we just spend enough, we'll reach that 100% level, but because of decreasing marginal returns, we don't. Conversely, we had this idea of, well, if we can just fix bugs earlier in the development process, we can solve all of our problems. It's cheaper to fix bugs at the design phase or the coding phase rather than wait to ship the bug to the customer, at which point the costs are huge. But this is a common model we have, is saying why we need to focus more on earlier in the development process. But the problem is that each phase has decreasing marginal returns. We can only spend so much in the design phase before we have to move still with bugs into the next phase. And by the way, this is why compliance sucks. Is because we can get close to compliance pretty cheaply, but get 80% of the way there. But to get 90% of the way there is a lot more expensive. To get 98% there is a hugely more expensive, and we're still not fully compliant. So why whenever we do our compliance tests, we're always not quite compliant, and sort of our auditors sort of fudge the last little bit. So that's why compliance costs so much, and why it's often more expensive than just trying to stop the hackers to begin with, is because we always try to get 100% compliant. So again, back to our rational conversation, why we need a firewall. It's because the additional benefits of this firewall, here are the additional benefits in monetary terms versus the additional cost, and then that's a logical thing that your boss will understand. Let's see that. So back to Economics 101, number 4 on Matthew's list. by the way, I'm going to 6, is incentives. This is a carrot and stuff. So a basic thing about economics is that people respond to incentives. We don't need to know much about the incentives, but we know that people do respond to them. If you give them a carrot, they'll go for the carrot. And it's often phrased with things like supply and demand. The higher the cost, the lower the demand. What I want to talk about is risk tolerance. Imagine that it's snowing out. You guys experience that here in this area of the country. You get these huge snowstorms coming through, so what do? Well, you respond to this incentive, or this increased danger presents an incentive, and what you do is you slow down. You pay more attention, you stop listening to the radio, you stop checking your text messages, and you pay attention to the road. And we all understand that. We all do that.
You haven't thrown it around here, have you?
Well, assume for the moment that's what people do. So imagine the converse of you're driving along and conditions change, so now it's sunnier. The road is now dry, it's now straight, you can see far in front of you, there's no other cars around, there's no other danger around. So what do?
Sleep.
You respond to incentives, which is there's a lot less danger, you fall asleep. You stop paying attention, you start checking your Twitter account, and so on and so forth. That's what you do. And no one ever thinks about that I respond to increased safety by taking increased dangers. But that's what we do. We can measure that with economics. So the consequences of this is, for example, with seatbelt laws. With increased seatbelt usage, we see increased driver error. And that comes out in statistics as increased pedestrian deaths. Because drivers, of course, don't experience the cost of their paying less attention and going to sleep on the road, but everyone else around them does. So we see with more seatbelts, people respond to incentives, pay less attention, and more pedestrians die. Sweden had this thing of where they switched from the wrong side, driving on the wrong side of the road, to driving on the right side of the road. And then you would expect, well, there's increased danger, so therefore there's going to be a lot more accidents after the changeover. And in reality, what they found was the reverse. People responded to the incentive of increased perceived danger by driving slower, taking fewer risks, paying more attention, and not checking their voicemail.
So they change every 18 months now.
That's the conclusion you should draw from this. So they had 30% fewer traffic accidents and fatalities afterwards, and then it slowly grew back up to be the same level as it was before. ABS brakes are a great example. Berlin, during the development phase, became all these Berlin taxis, and then measured the taxi drivers. Taxi drivers just became crazier. Crazy. But they became crazier. They did more aggressive, stopping quicker, accelerating faster, and swerving, and all sorts of stuff. And then we have things like, we all know that using my cell phone during, checking my voicemail while driving along here is dangerous. But we don't see that those numbers come out in the statistics. We think it's a risk. But the question is does the risk compensation, do they allow more distance while they're checking their voicemail or checking their Twitter account? Do they drive slower? Do they compensate? And well, here are the statistics. And we see with this huge rise in smartphone use, on the road, we don't see a spike in accidents. What we see in this graph going up and down are economic factors, which is why we see the dip there again in 2010 because of the recession. And we don't see in here changes like ABS brakes or any other technology, including cell phones. So yeah, cell phones are annoying because the person in front of you is like reading their cell phone instead of going into green light. But in terms of accidents, we don't really see any correlation there because people compensate for increased risk. They respond to incentives. So what actually improves safety is a question, what improves security? And the problem we have is that people, our employees that are trying to help, they respond to incentives. If I say, hey, passwords are weak, I need to increase passwords. Increase the complexity of passwords, we can change them every 24 hours, blah, blah, blah. What they do is they start doing these, like writing the post-it notes at the bottom of the keyboard. And they respond to incentives and they create a problem for us. Or an antivirus. Okay, when people don't have an antivirus on their desktop, they don't click on crap. Because they know it might affect me. Britney Spears video and stuff, I think, yes, she's hot, and open it. But maybe I shouldn't because I don't have antivirus. But as soon as the corporation puts antivirus on all the desktops, they'll click on it. So they respond to incentives. So we do all this extra effort to increase security, like adding ABS breaks, and we find that it doesn't have much effect. Firewalls are the same thing. We don't need to patch this bug. So Ron Gould was talking about patch management and stuff. Well, I've got a firewall, so therefore it's all protected. I don't need to patch it. And what they're doing is they're responding to incentives. The firewall gave me an incentive not to do security elsewhere. So overall, I add a little security, and I measure my security stance afterwards. I'm still getting hacked just as often. So one of the questions we have, okay, we know that people respond to incentives. How do you create good incentives? Well, I tried to come up with some good examples for this talk, and I really couldn't find any good ones. I just know there's lots of bad incentives. So like antivirus. Yeah, put it on everyone's desktop and tell them that it's not actually there. And maybe that's the incentive they don't need to know. So back to our rational conversation with our boss, why do I need a firewall? And I said, well, if I think in terms of this constant risk stance that more safety means I get to drive faster, for my web services, it means if I've got a firewall, it means I can enhance services. I can hook up to more customers. I can do a lot more with the firewall. I can do a lot more with the web services. So firewall might not necessarily mean more security. It just might mean I can take more risks. There's 6 items here, but they go from they're numbered 1 through 10 in Greg Mancu's book, and I'm assuming we're in a university classroom here, so his number is number 6. It's like mine's like second to the end. So in Mancu's list, he has his principle number 6 is that the market is usually the best way to organize things. It goes with number 7, which says, well, and regulation helps too. But we're going to focus on number 6 for the moment. And here's a good example. When you go to a movie theater, and you know that it costs them pennies for the popcorn and a few more pennies for the drinks. But they're horrendously expensive. It costs $4. They'll charge you $4 for what costs them pennies. And it really offends us all that they have monopoly control over us because we're in their theater and we can't go anywhere else and we can't bring in our own foods. Therefore, they can jack up the prices. That's really offensive. But here's the thing. At least in most areas of the United States, they don't charge to go to the bathroom. And in Europe, they do. At least all movie theaters I've gone to in Europe, they've always charged to go to the bathroom. And the thing to know about this is that the movie theater owners don't really have a choice. That they have fixed costs of how much it charges, how much it costs them to get the movie, and then show it to their customers. And then they can't choose what customers are willing to pay and not pay. In Europe, they're willing to pay to go to the bathroom. In America, they're not. In Europe, they're not willing to pay so much for popcorn. In America, they are. So therefore, the movie theater owner takes the mix of services and stuff, like parking is often free in malls and in suburbia, bathrooms are free, but they jack up the price of popcorn. And in the end, movie theaters in the United States aren't particularly profitable. Neither are they in Europe. So they're not really making this money that we think that they're making from their jacking up the prices for popcorn, because they have to pay for bathrooms, they have to pay for parking, they have to pay for a lot of stuff. And that's why economists say the market is usually the best way to organize things, is because instead of working on a theory of how much things ought to cost, it works on the principle of what people are willing to pay for. So how many people here use Wi-Fi? Which is everyone. How many people here have security as their highest concern? You know where I'm going here, but someone can say that. So anyway, so I did this talk. It's been about 10 years now. This was back when web application was insecure. I asked them 3 questions. How many rate cybersecurity as the highest concern? Everyone raised their hand. It was a security conference. How many people use Wi-Fi? Everyone raised their hands because everyone uses Wi-Fi. How many people think that their Wi-Fi is secure? Only one guy raised his hand and he uses a VPN over Wi-Fi. So these 3 statements can't all be true. They can't all work that way, because if security is your highest concern and you know your Wi-Fi is not secure, then why are you using it? So something's got to give. And here's the thing about people, they always lie. They don't tell you what they are willing to pay for. You can't measure people that way. You have to measure what they actually pay for. So to measure the security of Wi-Fi, we have to measure people by what they use. And so what we know from people is that minor amounts of convenience are worth the security problems. So convenience trumps security. And we hate that. We hate knowing that. That's what the market tells us. Even insecurity people do this. Our own convenience trumps security in many cases. So one of the things we say in cybersecurity is that, well, the internet's not secure enough. Well, obviously it is. People use the internet every day. Vendors, Visa allows credit cards to be used on internet sites. Obviously, the internet is secure enough for credit card transactions. Even though we're hacking them all day long, we're selling credit card numbers on these underground forums, we're SQL injecting and getting to the database and downloading everything. We know that, oh my God, the security is horrible. How can anyone use credit cards on the internet? Well, the market has spoken, it's secure enough. And I point this out because a lot of people don't really get that point of view. Back in the Bush administration, they had a document that said about how to secure cyberspace strategy. And one of the things they said is, we're going to rely upon the free market to solve this problem for us. And that misunderstands the free market. But the free market is saying it's not a problem. That's what the free market is saying. You can't have the free market solve the problem if it thinks it's not a problem. So I think this misconception about the free market is a great example to explain what economists say about the free market. By the way, this is how I felt. So let's talk about Mankiw's principle number 7, which I think is our last principle. Maybe I have one more, I forget. Regulation. And Mankiw's principle is that sometimes regulation does help. And unfortunately, it doesn't help as much as we should. So I'm going to talk more about the problems with this statement, even though it's true, why we can't rely upon it too much. By the way, this is a picture from a libertarian TV show by John Stossel, where he shows mountains of regulations passed every year, which is kind of a frightening thing. The basic thing we're talking about for regulation is solving externalities, is that my security decisions have an impact on my neighbors. When I don't patch, I get affected by a worm, that affects other people. Or my machine becomes part of a botnet or starts serving malware. My decisions affect others, and that's where we want to regulate. But how do we solve that isn't necessarily the way you think we should solve that. For example, let's say my neighbor has a fireplace and I've got a thatched roof. My neighbor's decision to have that fireplace and not have like something that controls sparks means sparks come out of his fireplace, land on my thatched roof, and cause it to get on fire. So obviously you think that the regulation should be to stop that guy from having a fireplace, the neighbor from having a fireplace. If I'm having a thatched roof, that's my thinking. And I think everyone would agree that that's the fair thing to do. It's not my fault that my roof is catching on fire. Except that when government and economists go through regulation, they don't agree. Which is why the laws in the United States allows fireplaces, but disallows thatched roofs. You can only have a thatched roof if it's got like tons of fire retardant and other stuff on it. And so what they care about is the end result. What's the least cost way of avoiding this problem? And the least cost way is to put the onus of not having any fires on the person with that thatched roof. Because when you think about it, the externality can go both ways. The person with the fireplace causes sparks, but the person with the thatched roof now has a zone around them where you can't have fireplaces, you can't have barbecues, you can't have fireworks, you can't have anything that's potentially causes a fire. So he imposes an externality on everyone else. So when we think about the best regulations for cybersecurity, they're not always orthogonal. They're not always the obvious what's fair, what's right. It's what's best is often something quite different. One of the things we, back 10 years ago, when Microsoft had all the power, these days they don't because they're kind of screwed in the mobile market. But back then, they were everything. And so we said, well, that market power needs to be solved. We need to do something about that with regulation. And we pretty much failed to do that. And there's a great XKCD cartoon. They said, remember back when we all knew that Microsoft needed to be punished? We didn't do that, and then, well, nothing bad happened. And we have the same sort of thing now with Facebook, Apple, and Google, is it seems right that we should punish them for all their wrongdoings. But in the end, 10 years from now, it's going to be some other company that's going to be the new big thing that we all want to punish. So one of the things is we grasped for regulation is we had this impression, well, that's just the sort of thing that government does. We're not quite sure why, or exactly the cost and benefits, but we just sort of assumed that's the sort of thing that government should do. Government should regulate cybersecurity because that's the function of government. But this leads to unintended consequences. There was a law passed in Australia that mandated helmets. And a few years later, people ran the numbers and found that it killed people. The reason it killed people is because people enjoy riding bikes when there's no helmets. They're just out in the sunshine having fun. When they have to wear helmets, it's no longer fun. So they stop riding bikes. Which means they stop getting exercise, which means they start dying from heart disease. So when you run the numbers of how many people were saved by helmets versus how many people died because they were no longer riding bikes, it's a net loss in life. And that's the problem with a lot of regulation, whether it's government or within corporations, is you're not quite sure what the consequences are of what's going to happen. Is that 15 or 5?
15.
So another problem is special interests. So here is the cancer deaths and the funding per death that we do for cancer. And if you look here, you'll notice something like breast cancer is we spend $13,000 per person who dies of breast cancer. But if you look at lung cancer, we spend only $1,000. And that's because, well, breast cancer has a lobby and lung cancer doesn't. Same thing with pancreatic cancer. We don't have a pancreatic cancer month. We have a breast cancer month. And why is one death worth more for one person than another person? And the reality isn't. In a fairer world, all these 5 would get roughly equal funding per death of the person who dies, because everyone's life is worth roughly the same. So it's another way of saying is that the squeaky wheel gets the grease. So our regulations, whether it's government or within an organization, a corporation, our rules are often focused by whoever's loudest and whoever promotes their interest the most. And something to fear with regulations is not so much whether it's a good idea, but whether it serves one person more than another. So I kind of rushed through this. So here are the 10, or the 6. Well, there's missing 5. So Great Manku has 10. And there are things like inflation and other stuff I can't correlate with cybersecurity, nor does the value trying to correlate, try to push the square peg to the round hole. But to review these things, they were, everything's a trade-off. You can't, we don't make a decision alone, like paying more money for cybersecurity means that money has to come from somewhere. There's opportunity costs, because that's not just money that we're sacrificing, these things like time to market and other things. We think of the margin. It's the additional value of security. So it's not whether that firewall securities or not security, it's about how much more security we get from it. And the more security we have, especially focused at a certain area, it has decreasing returns. People respond to incentives, perversely. We have this fixed risk tolerance, and if we get more safe in one area, we'll take more risks in another. And that's just human nature. Markets are the most efficient way of doing things, but regulation can help, but not often as much as people think. So that's the end of my talk. Are there any questions? Any discussion?
Supposing my firewall is going to cost me $25,000 a year, how do I measure the benefit that I'm getting into dollars for having a firewall?
So what feature of the firewall do you really, really like?
Say it blocks unwanted ingress into my network.
Okay, so a Linux system for free will do that. So the question is, what marginal feature of the firewall you're paying $25,000 a year for? What additional feature beyond just the free stuff or the cheap stuff are you getting? And that's the question you need to ask. Now, the answer, by the way, for a lot of us is, well, I can put this on my resume and I'll go get a job, I'll earn more. But from a security point of view is, what additional feature do I get from that firewall? And the thing is what additional feature do I get there, or can I spend that money better off, let's say, more antivirus licenses or something else?
Can I turn your presentation back on you? The Linux box isn't free. You get overhead and configuring and managing and all that, so.
Yeah, if you can just leave, please. And it's true, by the way. is that this idea that Linux is free is nonsense. But it is cheap. I mean, it's, whether it's a Linux box, a Barracuda box, or lower end products from various vendors, that's sort of your baseline. And when you say, well, why is more for a firewall? It's not that I need the firewall, it's I need this marginal increased feature. Yeah, you can simply leave.
You talked about benefits in your presentation, but you didn't talk about risks. Can you comment on how regulation, such as Sarbanes-Oxley or the data breach disclosure laws, affect risk and how we can discuss that with managers?
Right. Some of these things are different. Like the data breach disclosure laws are an interesting thing, sort of off to the side. I don't know how to put it into economic terms. The Sarbanes-Oxley it introduces a lot of risk for you, and and the big graph I use for that, if we go back, is the decrease in marginal returns for compliance. Is doing a few things for Sarbanes-Oxley is fairly cheap, inexpensive, will help your security too, so again, it's a win-win at one end of the graph. But to get to the last, overcome the 98% to 100% compliant is really, really expensive. And the fact is that there are compliant auditors out there that will just sort of fudge it for you. And that's what you should hunt for rather than try to fix the last 2%. The auditors know this. The auditors can come in and they say, well, I can always say that you're not compliant. They can always find something. And you have to be sort of nice to the auditor. And it's a sad fact in our industry. So that's the answers I have.
I like it.
Anything else?
Thanks for the presentation. In the government regulation section, it seems like when I've always taken economics class, it's always been about the idea of pricing the externality, figuring out how much the cost is. Do you think there's an application to that for security? Is that sort of have to be a government thing? Do you think there's an application at sort of a personal level?
So the thing is there's a couple of things. One of which is what externality are you pricing? Are you pricing it? Are you going to price the sparks coming out of someone's chimney, or are you going to price it with the guy who's thatcher is catching the fire? And so what seems fair to us is that, well, we're going to punish Microsoft. And how does Microsoft? Because it's the home user's decisions. So it's a home user that doesn't patch Adobe, doesn't patch Java, who doesn't do anything, has Windows XP from 20 years ago, and doesn't do anything. And for that, we're going to punish Microsoft. Well, it's the home user that has the problem. And that's the problem is that, well, we're all more home users than we are Microsoft, so we don't want to experience the cost ourselves. We want to push it all on Microsoft.
What about a case where, like, your personal data is stolen and the company, they didn't put as much money into securing data because it wasn't their data, and
right.
You're the victim of identity theft, not them.
So how much do you pay for Facebook?
Hard to say what my time is worth.
Well, yeah.
Just my soul.
But if government regulation imposes costs on Facebook to price this externality, well, then they're now a losing business, and they now have to make up the money somehow. And, well, they have to start charging you a monthly fee, for like $5 a month to use Facebook, at which point they then lose their customers, and now they're out of business. So that's the difficulty. We have these unexpected consequences for a lot of things that we do. And it's really easy to say, well, yeah, that's my private data. Now, conversely, there's no solution to this. There's always trade-offs. Lie to Facebook. Don't tell them your real name. Don't tell them your birthday. I have a Facebook account. I don't tell my birthday. I lie. I am in violation of the terms of service, and I might get arrested for it. But that's the trade-off. So maybe instead of trying to price this externality, we pass privacy laws which says that you can't demand someone, you can say all you want that you want their real birthday, but they never have to give it to you. And that's how I protect my privacy, and I don't care what happens to Facebook or anybody else. By the way, these are all pretty great questions. Anything else? Well, I guess we're done. And then the next talk, I guess, is the ending talk for the day.